Next session is presented by AK. AK cuts code for breakfast and is one of the most technical guys I've worked with in the past. And he has a series about custom connectors. So this is where you're sort of, balancing between configuration and customization. So the fusion there, which is also the topic of my session after AK's session. But yeah, over to you, AK.
All right, thank you. And today's topic is I have presented the creating the reusable custom connector, but I meant the code in the meetup. So this is the next episode of the series. So yeah, like I said, this is episode 2 of the custom connector series, and I will cover a little bit about the previous sessions, just so that we get a bit of the histories. And so the custom connector, and then today's sessions we mainly focusing on trigger and the custom connector, how we can create the different triggers. And also I would create a demo, show the demo, and I'm creating a pooling trigger with the custom connector. And obviously all my sessions talk about all the nice things and always end up with the caveats that this is where we need to be a bit of careful, what we need to be mindful, and about the Q&A. So if you have any questions in the middle of the session, just raise your hand or just shout me out and just let me know.
Okay, could you speak up a little bit louder?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yes, usually I'm kind of like a soft speaker. Yeah, so I will try to do that. And yeah, if you can hear, just let me know. Yeah. So the first thing, a custom connector, what is it? Well, custom connectors is basically the wrapper of the HTTP connector, which I call the HTTP connector as a magic connector in Power Automate. We got about 700 connectors, but I think HTTP connector is the most powerful connector because as long as you can do basically whatever you want. And basically, custom connector is a user-friendly version of HTTP connector. I will show you here. So if you look at the right-hand side, the top, that is the HTTP connector. How you use the HTTP connector versus when you use the custom connector, that became the second one. So you can see a lot of the information that's stripped out when you use a custom connector. So you don't need to worry about method, URL. You don't really need to worry about. All you need is the data that what we want to do. So this is where a custom connector is really powerful. Because of that, is it really easy to create a new one, to create a new HTTP custom connector? And there's a few ways that you can do, like you can import the Swagger. If you are the web API and developer guys, you will know Swaggers. A lot of people use a Postman. You can Postman the Postman collections. If you are the Azure guys, the guru, that you can create directly from the APIM to the publish to the Power Platform. And, if there's always a way that you can create manually, right? So, and this session, so all I'm showing is like a manual way. So because I rather get the manual way right first, and then we can do more fancy stuff. And when we create the custom connector, the previous sessions, I cover about how we can make it a reusable connector. So when I say the reusable connector is what today, many people create the custom connector in dev environment, UAT environment, production environment. And at MF, we have the multiple connection reference and multiple connections. So when I say the reusable custom connectors, this is what we're trying to achieve. We will have the one custom connector. We will have the one connection reference, but it could have different connections so that you only need to maintain one connector without maintaining 3 different types of connector across the environments. So this is just the 3 environments. Imagine you've got 6 environments. You could, that number will be multiplied. So the target that we're targeting is the right-hand side.
Can I ask a really dumb question?
Sure.
What's a connection reference?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah. So connector is basically just a definition of what the connector can do. Like it has the actions, it has a trigger. So for example, you want to create something in somewhere, right? That is the connector. The connection is I'll just skip the connection reference for a while. So connection is the actual connections to your data source. So it could be your SQL database, it could be your API, it could be even like a file system. But connection reference is basically like a glue in between the connector and connection reference, so that the connector is not dependent on the connections. So it is a process between the connector and the connections. So for example, we have the one connection reference. I want to define to the connections. I only need to switch this connection reference to the connection connections. Otherwise, we are kind of like finding the connector to use the connection connections. Does it answer your questions?
Yeah.
So the connector, and in the connector, we got the trigger, we got the actions, and this sessions, like I said, particularly we focusing on triggers. So when I say the triggers, there's two different type of trigger in the custom connector. One is the webhook connector, webhook trigger, which I'm not going to cover in this sessions because I'm trying to do that, but I find like webhook is requires like a few hour sessions just to go through the webhook, let alone a custom connector. So I'm going to cover the pooling trigger, which is kind of like a low-hanging fruit compared to the webhook trigger. There's a bit of the differentiation between what is a webhook and the pooling. So basically, this is the webhook. So you got the app here. So you can see this is a Power Automate flow. And you got the service provider. Here is the Shopify. So what the webhook idea is that you subscribe to Shopify or like a Stripe or like a GitHub. And when something happened there, it will send you a data back to the applications. It looks quite simple, but most of the time, we tend to do the continuous pooling. So we have the API from the Shopify. We got the applications. We keep asking the data from the Shopify. Hey, order created. Shopify say, nope. Like we take for like a 1 minute, X again, Shopify. Here's order created. No. So you can see there's a lot of the transition between your consumer app and the source. So this is where the pooling can be, the webhook can be the very good for the kind of like in terms of like a performance, and it reduces a lot of the transaction. So the third thing about this is I'm not going to cover webhook today, but the pooling. So we will see how we can use the pooling to expose the existing API as a connector trigger without doing much changes. Like I said, the webhook trigger is when we create a trigger in the custom connector, it's quite easy to set it and straightforward. But the thing is, the lead webhook is a mess in the webhook trigger, and if you already have the existing API, most of the API doesn't really support the webhook capability. You probably need to extend to support the webhook capability. So that's why it's more suitable to integrate with like commercial enterprise platform, like like Shopify, like Stripe, GitHub, Facebook, and if it is your own platform, like a custom API, I've never seen the webhook in the custom platform yet. So this is where the pooling trigger comes in. So it's quite easy to set up, and all you need is a URL to get the data. All you need is another is a response format. So if you ask something from the data source, it responds the data. So we need to know that to sample the data type. And we also just need to know another is like defining the trigger configurations. So when do we want to trigger it? And the good thing is there's no change need to make to the existing APIs. So I'll show you one of the demo I just created this morning. And that is the pooling trigger on the database. And so that means I'm not making changes on the database, but I can easily create a trigger from the database. So the pooling trigger mechanism is quite easy to understand. So we got the Power Automate here, we have the connector, and we got the backend service. So this is the service that you are trying to access. First, we access the data in the backend service. It returns something. If it returns something, we do something here. If it doesn't return, we try again and wait for the next set of data. So basically, we access the data. If we get something, it gets triggered. If we don't get it, okay, cool. Wait for again, and we will access again. And if we get more data, then we get triggered. So, any questions so far? Cool. All right, so this is the demo time. Hopefully, it works. So what I have here is I create a new custom connector, and we provide a bunch of informations, and this is the source of the service, right? The data source. So I'm using this OData, existing OData, the API. So I haven't created anything yet, and security as a custom connector, you can define authentications, your API key, your OAuth, or like a basic authentications. But in this custom connectors, currently I don't use any of the authentications. But another one, I use the OAuth authentications. And then next step is creation of the definitions. So in the previous sessions, I mainly focus on creating an actions. So an action is, I want to get the data, or update the data, or delete the data. These are the actions. But triggers are like when something happens, it ran the Power Automate flow, right? So in the Power Automate cloud flow, the first step is the trigger, and the rest are the actions. So you could use that trigger as in your flow to trigger. So here we define is just summary, the name, and in this request. So you can input from the sample. To do that, basically, I created a new service called the trip pin, and this is freely available and just for the demonstration purpose. And all I do is copy this URL and put it here, and define the sum query, the filter, and order by, and get persons. And this is quite straightforward because this basically you just need the URL from your API to get the data. So you will get all these, and the interesting thing is the trigger configurations. So here we say I want to dynamically define the condition of the connector to trigger this filter. This filter is trip ID greater than the latest trip ID. So basically, when I add the new trips, I will have the trip ID, and when I add another trips, it will create another a trip ID. So basically, connector know what is the latest trip ID, and based on that, it will access data. And where do we get it from? Trigger.body.value. So there's a bit of like an expression coding. It's not really like a hardcore coding, but as soon as you create it, all right. So I got this pooling trigger demo. So what would happen is, you could see I tried a few times just to make sure the demo is still working. So now let me switch to the Postman. Right. So this Postman is basically creating a trip to the data source. So let me add another trip to 5. And my budget is like a $20 from Wellington to Queenstown for leisure drink nature. hopefully it might work. And send it. So this data is now going to serve.o data with the data source, and you can see 201 created succeeded. Now coming back to the Power Automate flow, let's refresh it. Yeah, so this is the challenge with the pooling trigger. The pooling trigger, it's like run every 60 seconds, 120 seconds. I'm just making things up, I don't really know, but but it's quite slow, right? So it is not a real time. It is, which in the webhook, it could be almost real time, because in the webhook, as soon as you add the thread, it will send a message to the Cloudflow, and it will trigger straight away. So this is one of the caveats that I describe in the next slides. All right. So while we're waiting for that, you can use like a Power Automate and a Power Platform, right? And one of the things, the connector that you will mostly use is Database connector, right? So in the Database connector, it's currently called current environment connector. Previously, they called like current environment. You can only connect to the current environment, right? Can you connect to the outside? If you have two database, you can do it, right? We are able to use to do that is if the connector is legacy now, so it is all duplicated. Now the shiny one, it can only connect to one data source. So what I did this morning is that I created a custom connector to listen the something happened on another database. And if the record is added on the another database, I want to trigger a flow on another database. So this may not be the really good example, but just to show you the capability, what we can do, because all these API, just to make sure, like I haven't written that, right? I'm using the database API, this Microsoft written that, and using the pooling connector, I like to show how these two databases can communicate each other. So here, what I have is a contact entity, everybody know that. And the custom connector that I created is if the contact is created in this database, which is the org, b, blah, 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 and I want to trigger a Power Automate that has existed in another database. Right. Okay. It's safe. That contact record is created in the Power Pages preview environment, which is a different environment. Now, currently, I am in this ACADE environment. So my flow is created in ACADE environment. And if everything fine, I should see new lines here, but probably not now. So while we're waiting for that, let's go back to the previous trip one, right? Trip. This one. But now you will see, from the postman, I created a new trip. And this trip, the Power Automate is triggered 1 minute ago. So there was a delay around like 2 to 3 minutes between the actual time to trigger it. So if I open this, Because say one new trip is added, and this is the data that I posted from the postman. So just to show you, when something happened on the API, the Power Automate can be triggered. Hopefully this will work now. Oh, not 2 minutes yet, I guess. All right. Surely we'll trigger, I guess. Right. So while we're waiting for that, let's just continue it. So we've got time. So carry with the webhook trigger. So you can see, yeah, this worked great. Not really great, like a 2-3 minutes delay, and that worked well. And you don't need to change anything on the your existing API. But with the webhook, you do need additional work to support the webhook capability in the existing APIs. So that means if you already have the existing API, do not assume that you can use the webhook trigger, because you need extra work to include the webhook mechanisms in your API. So that's why it is really good use, just my opinion. If it is a commercially like enterprise platforms, probably webhook is the recommended choice, because you say product, you say something, you give the service. And then if you're building this type of commercial enterprise platforms, and definitely you will put into like a capability to the webhook functionality to the existing APIs, and that you can easily create a webhook trigger. And also, when you're creating like a time-sensitive process, must be real time. You can wait for 2-3 minutes. Probably webhook is the better choice. KV with the pooling trigger, as you see, like we have delay on like a 2-3 minutes, and even though the data itself is really small and everything is happening in the cloud, the performance can be slow. Why is it slow? It is more like a, whether you can accept it or not. Sometimes if you don't really need to wait for that, probably you can accept it. And because the pooling trigger has the little or no additional works to make on your existing API, so it is really useful for exposing the legacy platforms into the cloud, right? So you don't want to make any changes to your existing API, and you have no resource to do that, for example. And time is not a problem. You could wait for 2-3 minutes. Then obviously, pooling trigger is a really good choice, and you can quickly open up the new a new window. Probably might be a really good use case for like a small to medium business, because where you may not have a time sensitivity. And now the KVS of the triggers on the customer coordinator. So we talk about like how we can trigger it, how we can use the webhook to on near real time trigger. And probably sometimes these triggers may not be very useful at all. And sometimes the messaging service like Azure service or Azure Event Grid might be the better options, especially when it comes to the public sector enterprise platforms, right? And the public sector enterprise platforms, you got legacy applications and platform, right? And being the public sector, they don't want to make changes to that. And also they want the best, right? So if we want to make changes, the only choice we have is pooling triggers, right? But once you use the pooling triggers, we got the performance problem. So in that case, probably the better choice is to use something like Azure Service Bus and Azure Event Grid, and also that gives us more like a decouple between your platform and the other services. Right. Is it running? Yeah. So I created the content on the another database, but this float is in the another database, and this get trigger, and I still get the data that I created from the other database. So this is an end of the demo, just to show how we can easily create a trigger-based connector from any existing APIs without making much changes. So any questions that you have, I'm happy to answer it.
There's obviously a lot of ways to skin a cat from a services implementation point of view. Do you find that you can make the right call up front, or is it often a case of you need to do a little bit of experimentation and just do a bit more deep understanding before you can kind of land on a right solution? How often do you have to change tact?
Yeah, generally, we prefer custom connector, at least over HTTP. Just one of the reason is the governance reasons, because like I said, once you open an HTTP connector, it's just one connector, but it can connect to any API, right? So using a custom connector, we kind of put it into the governance in place, and deciding which trigger we like to use, probably that has to come later. But in the Wellington, in most of the governments, probably messaging is a bit better options, at least for now. But this custom connector trigger is, like I said, is particularly useful for those commercial products. It's more like an enterprise platforms products.
So if it's not a time sensitive thing you need to do, then it's a quicker way, easier way potentially of doing things than spinning up Azure.
Yeah.
That's the APIs. Is it possible to create connectors that reflect with other data sources?
Sorry?
Is it possible to create custom connectors with other data sources that API, like SQL database, or maybe another data source that not available.
So I'll just repeat the question. So the question is the custom connector can connect to other different data source rather than apart from the API? So in short, is no, because custom connector is an HTTP connector, so it has to be kind of like a REST endpoint and publicly exposed, or at least we should be able to access.
And is there a limitation that has to be REST endpoint for any APIs?
Yeah, I mean, HTTP endpoint, that will work. And there's a few limitations around the authentication. So currently it only supports an API key. Obviously, you can just see the no authentications, which may not be quite good for the public sector. And you can use basis authentication, which is quite outdated already, right? So the next one is that you can use OAuth, but OAuth, when you use the OAuth, it must be the authorization code flow, which means user need to sign in. You cannot use the server to server side, server to server integrations.